For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Gannon. I'm the coordinator of the International Network of Justice Improvement Organizations. It's an honor for me on behalf of the network to welcome all of you to the first in our series of network-sponsored webinars. We begin today with 10 things you need to know about crisis intervention, presented by Troy Siewert. As you know from the registration form, Troy is a retired police lieutenant, 30 years of service, who still trains justice professionals in responding to mental health crises. He's a certified crisis intervention trainer, coordinator, officer, crisis negotiator, and congratulations to Troy. He was the Crisis Intervention Trainers International 2021 Coordinator of the Year. So we welcome Troy and look forward to his presentation as another step in our efforts to improve justice everywhere we can. There's always a crisis in the world, and our times are no exception. None of us can fix everything, but each of us can improve something in our own local areas of influence. For those of you who are not familiar with the network, as you might guess, the International Network of Justice Improvement Organizations is working to connect people and agencies who are interested in advancing justice and creating new justice possibilities among our members. The power of networks has been deeply misunderstood and very much underestimated. We ascribe to the belief that community problems are most likely to find successful resolution when those resolutions arise in the community themselves. And as a companion to that thought, we believe our members and their communities have the strength, the knowledge, and the will to improve justice policies and practices. And that banding together in a network, we can attract others to local projects with support, expertise, and funding. And that's the purpose of the network. We seek to connect people with similar interests and commitments in order to build a larger global justice neighborhood where we can exchange ideas, create innovations, and develop organizational strength so that we can improve justice and add value to community well-being. Troy's going to talk today about how knowledge of crisis intervention strategies can advance justice in many places. If you're interested in learning more about how you might contribute to advancing justice in your own location, please go to our umbrella website for the Global Justice Resource Center. And that's at Global Justice RC, all one word, globaljusticerc.org. There are no fees or charges or costs of any kind. globaljusticerc.org. And I also hope to connect with many of you by email within a few days after this webinar. So Troy, again, I want to thank you so much for being with us today, and I'm eager to hear your presentation.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and those kind words and welcome, John. I do appreciate it. I am going to go ahead and share my screen so that everyone doesn't have to watch my my ugly mug here. It is 2 o'clock in the morning where I am, so you'll probably see a few bags under the eyes or a little red in the eyes there. So let me go ahead and share the screen. I do have a little bit of a presentation, so as I talk here, you guys will be able to see that. Okay, and that should be on the screen, right?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I know I wasn't aware of the fact that John was going to do such a wonderful job introducing me. I just wanted to put something up there in case all of you were wondering, who is this guy and you know, what qualifies him to be talking today. I'm just a guy who has put my 30 years in law enforcement and spent a lot of time dealing with mental health crisis situations and interceding, getting people connected to the treatment that they need, de-escalating those situations. And so I recognize that many of you are working in the correctional facilities, and certainly there are a lot of those types of situations there as well. So just a little bit about me, that I want to let you know that I do have a bit of experience here in this particular area. So as John said, what we're talking about here today is the 10 things that you need to know about crisis intervention in the correction setting. So I think the most important thing to start out with is to define what is a crisis. What are we talking about here, and how does a crisis actually occur? A crisis, as we're going to define it here, is a perception or experience of an event or situation that causes intolerable difficulty that exceeds a person's known resources and coping mechanisms and causes them great psychological distress. So what does that mean in a nutshell? It means I've got a lot going on in a situation. I don't have the coping mechanisms to deal with this. I don't know where to turn for assistance. That's causing me a lot of psychological distress. So there's definitely some signs and symptoms of things that happen when people go into a bit of a crisis. They could be more impulsive, oftentimes have little to no regard for authority because they are in that crisis state. Some compromised rational thought. They have difficulty forecasting consequences, trouble making decisions. Often they cannot see positive outcomes when they're in this state of mind. They just feel totally out of control and powerless. And oftentimes their escalating behavior is an attempt to gain some control and power over the external circumstances. So asserting power and dominance over another person or the situation often seems like the best solution, or their only solution. So what happens? What happens in the brain when this crisis happens? What makes us feel that we're so out of control? And while I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a psychiatrist, it kind of gives us a better understanding of what we're dealing with and how to better interact with individuals if we know what they're going through and what we're going through. The human brain has 3 sections. They call it the reptilian brain, the limbic system, and the neocortex. If you look on the bottom right-hand corner there, I have a little diagram kind of shows you where those are. The primitive brain is made up of the reptilian and the limbic system. And so that reptilian brain there, that is responsible for our instinct and survival. That's what keeps us alive. That's what keeps us breathing. The fast reactions. The limbic system is where the emotions take place. That's where our basic emotions like anger and fear and those things come from. And then if you look up a little bit higher, on top of all that is what they call the evolved brain or the neocortex. And that's the area that controls speech, logic, the higher functioning skills. And in the very front, if you look at that picture that I got on the top right corner of your screen there, that little purple area, you can see where they got the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex, that's where all our reason, rationality, logic, decision-making, that takes place up there in the prefrontal cortex. Well, there's another little area called the amygdala that's in there that you can see, that little red area. There's 2 of them, one on each side of the brain, and that acts as our brain's alarm system. So it senses when there is bodily safety or survival, right? So it goes off, it's very fast. It's faster than the cognitive awareness of the evolved brain, that neocortex, that prefrontal cortex. And it senses when there's danger, right? When there's a threat to us. That's our body's alarm system, right? And what it does when it senses a threat is it tells the adrenal glands, go ahead and release adrenaline and cortisol throughout our system. And when that happens, our system sends more oxygen and blood to the muscles, to the heart, to the lungs, all the major muscle groups. Our pupils dilate, which makes our vision fast or enhanced, and it increases our blood sugar levels, which gives us more energy. All that is made to help us survive, right? We can fight or we can flee, fight, flee, fight, flight, or freeze. So it's directing the oxygen and blood to the areas of the portion that have us run away or engage in a fight to fight the threat. Unfortunately, our brain cannot differentiate, at least there in the amygdala and the limbic system and the reptilian brain, the difference between a psychological or emotional threat and an actual physical threat. So the difference here is if someone is actually trying to take your life, that is a physical threat, versus somebody insulting you in front of your loved ones or taking away your pride and really getting those emotions up. That's an emotional threat. But unfortunately, your brain's interpreting that as a threat. And so that amygdala kicks in. It's called an amygdala hijack. The alarm system goes off. It sends that blood and oxygen to those muscles. And what that does is it takes that blood and oxygen away from your prefrontal cortex, where that rational thought takes place. So what's happening is you're in that fight, flight, or freeze, right? So it can be good or bad, because if you have somebody trying to take your life, you don't want to be thinking, I wonder what I should do next. You want to be able to react and act quickly. But if it's an emotional threat, you can see where when your life is not on the line, you lose that ability to rationalize, to think, and to make good judgments, because you're not using that neocortex, that prefrontal cortex of the brain, right? You're in that reptilian and limbic system. And so that's the bad side of what happens when you go into crisis. You perceive those emotional threats, and we are not thinking properly. We're not using that prefrontal cortex. So when we do crisis intervention, what we want to do is we want to get people back up into that prefrontal cortex, that neocortex, right? We want to get them out of that reptilian and that limbic system, that reptilian brain. We got to get them thinking again. So what are some ways that we start addressing that? The second thing we need to know is the importance of self-care and emotional regulation in all of this. Let's go before the crisis ever happens, and let's start talking about these things, because they do make a difference. If you look on the top left, I've got self-care in there. What do I mean by that? That is the taking care of yourself. You'll see I have the oxygen masks from a plane there. And I did that because when you're in the plane and they give you the instructions, what do they tell you? They tell you when the masks come down, rather than go what your instinct is and put your masks on your children and other people with you, put the mask on yourself first so that you can then take care of other people, right? We cannot pour from an empty cup. So what we want to have happen is we want to make sure that we take care of ourselves before any crisis, so that we are in a place where we can be there to help other people and we can maintain ourselves, right? So these are the types of things that include diet, sleep, exercise, meditation, spending time with family and friends, right? So that you can be well-centered and grounded and know that when you go into work, you are your best self. And all you have to do is think, if you're having a really bad night or a really bad week and you're stressed out and you go to work, how many times have you thought to yourself, yeah, I'm pretty quick that switch can flip, right? Because I'm walking into work already frustrated and aggravated. So we need to take care of ourselves before we even get to those crisis situations. The next part starts to get into that emotional intelligence, and part of emotional intelligence is self-awareness, right? You can see that I've got that triangle on the top right there with thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And those three really do feed into one another. So what I think and the things that I ruminate on can impact my feelings and how I feel about something. And then my emotions and my feelings can certainly drive my behavior. And you know that. We've all seen that happen, right? But by the same time, it might be my feelings do the behavior, and then I think about it. It can go all three ways, but your thoughts, your feelings, and your behavior are really, really related. So we need to be cognizant of what it is that we are thinking, either not only before the incident, but while we're in the incident, right? So number one, we need to be aware of the types of things that we are thinking about other people, about the situation, because those are going to impact how we feel about them and then how we behave toward them, right? We also need to be aware of what our triggers are. What are things that people can say or do that are going to immediately start to flip that switch, get those strong emotions, and could possibly do that amygdala hijack for us, where we start engaging in behaviors without thinking. So we need to know what those triggers are so that we can manage them ahead of time when we go into a situation. So again, self-awareness and self-care are big parts of this before and during one of the crisis situations that you may be involved in. And then when you are in the moment and you are in that crisis, part of emotional intelligence is self-regulation. Because if you can't control yourself, you're not going to be able to control the situation. We want to respond to people. We do not want to react. We want to maintain a positive attitude and eliminate the negative self-talk. And that goes right back to that self-awareness, right? Because that's going to impact how we act. In the corrections environment, we really need to shift our mindset a little bit and start thinking, hey, we're not in control of outcomes here. The inmates are. We're there to enforce the rules, but the inmate is in charge of the outcomes just by the choices that they make. So once we start to change that mindset, that will help us to self-regulate a little bit. Maybe we can regard them when individuals are being difficult as just being difficult people and a challenge, as opposed to thinking of them as combative adversaries. Again, that goes to that whole thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So we just don't want to let them push our buttons. We want to train ourselves not to have bias, prejudice, and expectations so that we then begin acting on that. Because when I treat somebody according to my thoughts and feelings, I act a certain way toward them, then they may start acting in accordance with that, which reinforces my thoughts and becomes the whole confirmation bias loop. We want to stay away from that. The last part of emotional intelligence that we're going to talk about here is that bottom right corner with the you, me, and we. And what I use that to represent was social awareness. And with social awareness, basically what that means is we need to have the ability to read other individuals. And if you're in the correction setting, that may be the inmate, but the individual with whom you are having an interaction, to see if we're coming across the way that we intend. Because so often we intend to say or do things a certain way, but it's not being interpreted that way. And being able to read the other individual and see how they're responding and then adjust appropriately and accordingly is going to help many crisis situations be averted just by making those corrections after you've noticed how they're responding to the way you're behaving and interacting with them, right? So just recognize that with all of us people come a whole bunch of people problems. We have emotions, we have deeply held values, different backgrounds and viewpoints. We have our own cognitive biases and partisan perceptions. Especially for men, our egos are easily threatened. Oftentimes when we're in an authority position, that can be the case. We can frequently confuse our perceptions with reality. So we need to take all of that into account, be aware of how they're responding, and then we need to react accordingly, right? Or respond accordingly. So number 3, what do we need to do? Want to maintain credibility and respect. This is a long-term thing, especially in the correction setting. You are dealing with the same individuals time and again. They're there for long periods of time, most frequently. So the 2 things we want to do is maintain credibility and respect. Because even going into this ahead of the crisis, many can be averted just by doing these things. So what do I mean when I say being credible? There's a whole bunch of things. I mean, number 1, don't lie. Obviously, if you're lying, your credibility is shot. We want to make sure that if we're promising something, that we're going to follow through, and we are not promising something that we can't deliver on, right? We're always going to do what we say we will. We're going to be consistent with everyone. If I do something for person A, I need to do it for person B, I need to do it for person C. And if I'm doing things a certain way this week, I need to do them the same way next week and the week after that. I have to have that consistency in order to be credible. And as far as consistency, try to be the same person every day. Because if one week you're that highly emotional, angry, charged individual, the next week you're super nice and inviting, they're not going to know which officer they're going to be getting that week. And we need to be consistent so that we can have that relationship and maintain that credibility, right? When we're interacting with individuals, our body language needs to be consistent with our nonverbal, with our verbal and our nonverbal. So my body language needs to match the words and the tone of voice that I'm using. Because I can tell you, hey, it's no problem. But if I'm looking at you, hey, it's no problem, you're not buying it. I'm not credible, right? So I need to make sure that that is all in jive. And then if you have incidents with an inmate and they are separated from the population, whatever happens there, we don't tell the other inmates when they're back in population what happened. For those of you who are in corrections, you know that when you separate an inmate from the population, oftentimes the act drops, they become their real person, they become more vulnerable, more cooperative. you don't then want to go tell all the rest of the population that they changed when they were alone, right? You want to maintain that credibility. We also want to show respect. And how do we maintain respect? A lot of the same things, but the first one, bar none, is that we need to understand in this corrections settings the importance of status. So much in the correction setting is based on status, and we need to acknowledge that, right? Because they've had so much taken away from them, that one of the only things they have left in the way things are run in a jail or a prison system is based on status within that hierarchy. So we need to acknowledge what their status is, treat them accordingly, and above all, avoid humiliation at all costs, because that is going to instigate a crisis. So we don't want to do that. We want to be fair, consistent, not talk down to them, don't mock them. Again, we're not going to lie. We do, however, want to remain alert and be decisive, because that indecisiveness is not going to get you any respect, right? You need to be confident, alert, and decisive in order to get that respect. Just when you look at these individuals, separate their behavior from them. Know that that is not necessarily who they are. We're going to talk more about what drives behavior in a little bit. We're not going to use offensive or insulting language to them. And we really, truly do want to respect culture. We have oftentimes in a prison population, people from many different cultures. And we want to make sure that we're respecting that in our interactions, because if we don't, that oftentimes is a quick trigger to set things up and escalate into a crisis. And lastly, I'll close off the showing respect with leave the inmate feeling better than you found them when they were at their worst, right? Lift them up, don't bring them down. They are people too. And that's going to show that you respect them as an individual. So those are all the things we can do to maintain credibility and respect. When you say, well, how do I get respect? Because I need to be respected, you're right. And in order to get respect, you have to give respect. So I'm just going to go right back to that, how to maintain credibility and respect. When you do those things, that is going to get you the respect, because respect is earned, it is not given. So let's move on to the next one. That would be number 4, how to approach a crisis scene safely. Because no matter how much we've done and prepared, oftentimes a crisis is going to happen. There's going to be insults. There's going to be needs that are not met. Individuals are going to go up into crisis. So what are some things that we can do? Number 1, we want to approach a scene safely. What does that entail? I want to do some preparation. And what do I mean by preparing? Because I don't know when the crisis is going to happen. No, but you know what? We need to know ourselves. You need to know what your capabilities and your competencies are. So are you in shape? Are you out of shape? Are your defensive tactics up to snuff? Do you have a bad back? Do you have a bum knee? Are you really not feeling up to it today? Psychologically, are you really on a short wick today? Are you maybe not the best person to interact with this individual? We need to know those things ahead of time going in. One of the benefits of a correction setting is that we know the inmates because we're with them 24/7, right? They are there on a long-term basis. Where with being in law enforcement, so often I had no idea the individual that I was going to interact with. It'd be the first time I've ever met them. But if you have the opportunity to know your inmates, know who they are, what their status is, what their role is, what their danger signals and cues and their capabilities and competencies are, right? We need to know all that. Maybe even some things that are their interests and likes, things that we can use to connect with them and get them to de-escalate when the time comes. All things to know ahead of time before the crisis. And know your policies, which I just noticed I misspelled. But yeah, so we need to know your policies, because if you don't know what you can do when the crisis happens, you're going to hesitate or freeze, and they're going to see that. And when they see that, that's going to escalate. So you have to know what it is that you can do, what you're allowed to do. So you've prepared, the crisis happens, you want to assess the scene. One of the first things that you want to do is you need to try to identify, why is this inmate escalating? And there's basically 3 reasons that you can have escalating behavior. One would be reactive. So they are reacting to some type of stimulus, something that happened that the emotion is reacting to, and they're escalating their behavior because of it. The second reason is it instrumental? Are they behaving in this escalated state? Are they getting in an escalated crisis situation in an effort to obtain something? Are they using this behavior as a means to get something? And then the last one is this a result, this escalation in behavior, is it because of mental illness or substance use? And I'm guessing most of the time in corrections, it's probably not substance use, but it may very well be mental illness. And we need to keep that in mind because that certainly brings with it its own set of needs and intervention techniques. So we've determined, hey, why are they escalating? What are some other things that we need to do? What are the points of egress and ingress, right? How can people get in and out? Is there paths of escape? Are there weapons present? What are the obstacles and barriers that may cause issues with us getting in or rolling around or be a safety hazard? Other people that are there, what role do they play? Are they just witnesses? Are they encouraging things? Are they escalating things further? Are they part of the problem? Are they waiting to take your back when you get in and engage with the subject? So all things that you need to think about, and then use the proper tactics. So this is not a tactical course, but you need to do things like keep your distance, don't get in their intimate space, keep your reactionary gap. But I'll leave that to you guys to do the tactics portion of it. But we do need to set boundaries, because just because we're going through this interacting and de-escalating does not mean that we don't set boundaries. It's just a matter of how you do it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on here. So continuing on with assessing the scene, some of the other things that we're going to do is we want to check our body language. When we walk into this crisis scene, the first thing when they look up and they see us, what do they notice? How are we carrying ourselves? Are we protruding or exuding weakness because they're going to capitalize that and continue to escalate? Or are we exuding arrogance? And I'm going to come in and I'm just going to beat you down. And this is not, I've had it with you, because that's going to continue to escalate. Or are we coming in where we're confident, right? Where don't test me, but I'm not here to beat you. I'm here to be fair, and I'm here to make sure that the rules are carried out. So we need to make sure that we have the appropriate body language when we go in there. Then our verbal communication. So when we're talking, we want to give clear, simple, and enforceable boundaries, right? This is not a time for long, extravagant, run-on sentences. But again, it's how we say things. It's not just what we say. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go on here. But just remember that your tone and your inflection convey about 40% of your attitude. So we need to pay attention to our tone and our inflection as we're talking. And again, as I mentioned earlier, with that being consistent and getting credibility, you want to make sure your verbal and your nonverbal, your body language, are consistent in communicating the same message. Just as an aside, it has been said or reported that a lower pitch voice or a lower tone of voice can sound more authoritative and competent than a higher pitch. So if it's at all possible, and that's within your ability to do, try to keep a lower tone as opposed to a higher tone. So instead of saying, I might not say, sit down, John, as opposed to sit down, John. Just that lower tone seems to reflect more authority and competence. So some different things that you can think about. And you can see on the bottom right, I've got audience management, and that's a big one in correction settings. For those of you who've been in there, you know that when you're in front of the crowd, that individual with whom you are interacting, for them, sometimes it's a show, but other times they're backed into a corner because they can't back down in front of all the other individuals, right? So it makes it very difficult. So we need to manage that. And we need to think to ourselves, let's separate the individual from the audience. So we can either bring him away from the audience, or we can get the audience distracted, all the other inmates and people that are paying attention to this, and so that you have your sidebar with the individual. Because I'm sure that you've seen, when we separate that individual, the act comes down. They're not as ramped up. They come back down, and they're more willing to collaborate, communicate, and work with you. So we want to really manage that. Number 5 thing you need to know, we've gone in, we've assessed the scene. How about this? Let's not make things worse by what we're doing, right? We want to avoid being the thing that escalates this. So what are some things that we can do to not escalate things? There's a lot of them. We'll just go through a few of them here. If we can, I only want one officer talking at a time as opposed to multiple. So frequently we go on scene, we have multiple officers yelling at the inmate, and unfortunately we're not yelling or communicating, I should say, the same message. In fact, oftentimes I've seen officers yelling completely opposite messages, telling the subject to do something that's completely opposite with the other officers. That adds anxiety to the individual that we're dealing with and escalates the situation. We don't want that. If at all possible, we want to try and talk in a calm, confident tone. We want to model that behavior that we want to see. Think in your own life, when you hear somebody yelling at you and you yell back, they keep yelling over each other, right? So we don't want to do that if at all possible. Are there times when we have to yell? Absolutely. But just know that the preferred way, the way to de-escalate is to try and talk in a calm, low voice, but a confident tone. Please don't tell them to relax or calm down. I think you've probably seen in your own lives that that never works. And in fact, when you tell somebody to calm down or relax, that does the exact opposite and it gets them even more upset. They'll come back with, don't you tell me to calm down. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to stack questions or statements, demands, requests. In other words, I don't want to ask a whole bunch of questions one after the other. So I need you to come over here. I need you to sit down. Then I want you to give me this, take your shirt off, turn around and tell me what happened over there. When they're in that reptilian brain limbic system, that emotional driven, not thinking with that prefrontal cortex, they're not taking in all of those questions. They can't process it. And what it may do is cause them more anxiety and escalate things further. We don't want that. So because of that, we do want to give them time to respond, right? When we ask them questions, give them time to respond. We don't want to interrupt them and talk over them. That can be seen as disrespectful, and certainly they're not getting their point across. That would make things worse. Don't want to talk down or mock them. I don't know that this would happen too much in the correction setting. I see it on the street. Oftentimes officers will whisper to one another. Usually it's about logistics, like the ambulance is on the way, or, I have another person give me some information. But the downside to that is the subject who's in crisis thinks you're talking about them, and that's going to escalate them further. So we don't want to do that. Don't touch them until it is absolutely necessary and you're going to go tactical, because I'm sure you've seen, once you put hands on, you get the don't touch me, and it escalates things. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to deceive them to get what we want. That's a short-term solution, because they're going to figure out they've been lied to, and your credibility just went down and it ruins it in the future. And not to mention the potential of an explosion escalation, explosive escalation when they find out that they got lied to. So we don't want to compare them to other individuals in the jail. We don't want to judge them, because once that happens, that's going to trigger the emotion and escalate things. Try not to use exaggerating words like always, never, whenever, because when you do that, it sounds judgmental, accusatory. It's going to hit those emotional buttons and it's going to escalate things. So we don't want that, right? When possible, we want to try and explain what the next steps are, what we're doing and what's going to happen, because we as humans have an innate fear of the unknown. It increases our anxiety when we don't know what comes next. And we tend to fill in the blanks. And most oftentimes, what we fill in is worse than it actually may be. But our perception becomes our reality, and we respond to that. So we want to make sure we can try to explain to them the next steps. And above all, with this, when you're interacting in these crisis situations, I tell officers, don't hurry, because when you hurry, it looks like you have an agenda and you don't care about them. These things take time, and you'll see why as we start talking about more of these intervention techniques. They take time. So we can't rush it, because if you do, you're going to shortchange yourself and potentially escalate the situation. And we don't want to do that. So now we move on to number 6. We start with the de-escalation stuff, right? We've talked about not escalating, how we de-escalate. The first thing that we need to understand, what motivates people are needs and interests, right? It is not necessarily positions. So unmet needs, when people aren't having their needs met, that is what's driving a lot of this behavior, because they're not having their needs met. So what are some of the things that people may be reacting to that's causing this behavior? Well, it might be feelings that they're not being treated fairly. Their sense of fairness has been violated. They don't feel that they've been understood. There's no empathy, right? Whether it's by you, by others, by the institution, they're not being understood and their needs aren't being met. Their sense of autonomy, their ability to make decisions has been taken away even more in the prison than it was just by being there. Or perhaps recognition. You guys see that all the time in the correction setting. I talked about status and role, right? If that status is violated or they're not getting recognized for what their status is, that could be a huge thing that drives it. And truly at the core of all anger is a need not being fulfilled. And it could be pride, shame, it could be a sense of justice. Violence oftentimes is a belief that other people have caused our pain and they deserve punishment. And for that, we do violence, right? And so often in the prison when we're being yelled at and they're yelling intimidating messages, it's people just trying to get a need met. So we need to find out what those needs are, right? And when we find what those needs and those interests are behind the feelings, sometimes the feelings are the first thing you could see, like he really looks angry, or man, he really looks sad, or they look scared. When you find out what those feelings are, then we need to find out, well, what's the need? What need that's not being met is causing that, right? When we start focusing on that, that's when we're going to make a difference. So some of the things that we can find when we're talking about what are the unmet needs, you can see the questions that I have on the screen here, right? Because it could be a physical pain. It could be that shame or disrespect. It could be that they are using this behavior for, I say officer shopping, like, right? This officer, I can get away with this, and that's going to get my behavior. It's going to get my needs met. So there's different questions that we can ask to try and identify where this individual's needs are, which one is not being met, because that's where the difference is going to be made. But take your time here, because again, if we move too quickly to problem solving, we may actually sound dismissive, and we don't want to do that either. We truly want to be seen as somebody who is attempting to understand this individual, what their needs are, what's driving their behavior. So number 7, as we're finding out these needs and issues, we need to realize that we are dealing with people, problems, and positions. And I've talked a little bit about it. We're going to talk a little bit more. The first thing that we need to do, and I kind of alluded to this in the last one, is we need to separate people from the problem, right? I want to attack what the problem is, the unmet needs, the feelings that they have. It's not about the individual. So I don't want to blame them. I don't want them to feel threatened or attacked, because if I do, then they're going to get defensive and that's going to escalate things. I want them to realize that emotion is not the problem. The way they are choosing to act or behave is. So I want to listen non-judgmentally. I want to validate their emotions. I'm going to emphasize that I'm concerned and I want to meet their basic needs and just show them attacking the problem, right? Not them. So you can see, here's a pictorial demonstration. What are we doing? They have a position, right? They have needs and desires that they feel are not being met. And as a result, they have a position. Their position is, this is what I want done, because that's what's going to meet their needs. I don't want to address that little portion on the top there. I don't want to address their position, right? I want to address those needs and the desires. And the reason this works is because for every need and interest, desire, there's several possible ways of getting there. There's several possible solutions. If I get stuck on just their position about the thing that they're demanding, what their behavior is, then there's only one. It's either they get it or they don't. And that becomes confrontational and adversarial. And I don't want to do that. So when I start focusing on positions, I don't want to reject their position, right? I want to ask about the reasons for that position, why they took that position, because that's going to lead me into what their needs and their interests are. I don't want to attack their position that they had because I want to look for the needs behind it. When I reject their position, as I said, that just locks them in all the more, right? Because they have an unmet need, they've made their position. If I just reject that position, when someone says, no, you push, they push back. That continues to escalate things. We don't want to do that, right? So I just want to use questions, and I want to find out some of these things that are driving the behavior and causing them to take the position and act the way that they are. So what are some things that can drive emotion? And again, these are just some, it's not all. And I talked a little bit about it earlier, but people not feeling appreciated. So I want to show that I understand their point of view. I want to tell them that I find merit in what they're thinking. I want to communicate that I understand to them. People need to feel a sense of belonging and affiliation with a group or an organization, either within the organization. And even with me, when I'm interacting with them, I want to feel that connection or that bridge. People need to feel a sense of autonomy when that's violated, when they feel like they don't have any choice at all about anything. That can drive emotion. We've talked about status and role within the organization or within the institution already, right? No one likes to feel demeaned. And if you have an unfulfilling role, at least you're feeling trivialized and unengaged. So those are some potential things that can drive emotion that we need to be aware of, because that's going to lie in that bottom half of the iceberg there with the interest, needs, and desires. So number 8, active listening skills. I could do a whole course in this. We're just going to breeze right through it. Active listening is just that. It is active in that it takes effort, because you can listen 4 times faster than I can talk, and our minds tend to wander. So when we say active listening, it's the intentional focus on listening to an individual. And these are some techniques that we can use to show people that we're listening and get them to open up and talk. Number 1, minimal encouragers. There are this just small things that you can do to keep a conversation going. So like a nod, yes or no is a nonverbal, and saying things like, really? Okay, I see. No? Those are your verbal ones. Your physical ones are shaking the head and just kind of looking concerned, but it shows the individual that you're engaged in the conversation. Open-ended questions, that's when we ask people a question that can't be easily answered with a yes or no. It invites them to give us an explanation, tell us information we didn't know. Reflecting is when we reflect their feelings back to them. Oh, so you're really feeling scared about this, or you sound really scared. Effective silence, when we ask difficult questions or we ask those open-ended questions, we need to give them time to answer. Don't just cut them short, let them expound on it. Paraphrasing is when we repeat things back to the individual that they've said in our own words as we understand them. It checks for understanding and it shows that we have heard them. I, we statements is how we set limits. So instead of saying, you need to stop yelling. They're going to look and say, I'm not yelling. Well, you need to stop yelling. I'm not yelling. Well, now we're having an argument about whether or not you're yelling. Instead, what I like to say is, I feel as though I can't understand you when you talk at that level. I appreciate if you could talk a little softer so that I could help you. Right? That'll help them to understand that they need to talk a little more softly, and it does work. Emotional labeling, when someone's talking or yelling or interacting with you, you just find the underlying emotion that we talked about here, and then you label it. It sounds like you're really pissed off, or you must really be angry, or God, that's really got to get you down. And then summarizing is just paraphrasing plus emotional labeling. It's just telling them what they've told you in your own words and attaching the emotions to it. So you've told me this, 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 and this, and it really makes you angry. Now they feel like they've been heard, right? They've been validated. And when that happens, when people have seen that you've taken the time to understand them and how they see their situation and why they feel the way they do and what their need is, you start to establish some rapport. And when you establish that rapport, you start to gain some influence, the ability to influence these individuals. Why? Because we're focused on their behavior, not their attitude, and their needs and interests, not their positions. And that allows everyone to save face. And saving face, again, because status is such a big thing in the jail, is huge. This is the FBI behavioral change staircase. It was made by Gary Nossner. It was used, it's still taught to all the FBI agents. And you can see, again, I could do a long course in it, but just to give you a brief understanding, so often we as officers and in corrections, we go straight to the top in behavioral change, and we're going to enforce change. And this is saying, no, take your time, use the active listening skills, so the arts start to understand where these individuals are coming from, why they feel the way they do, what their unmet needs are. And when they start seeing that you're doing that, you start to build rapport, you can get that influence, and then you start to use that influence to get to behavior change. And that brings us to number 9. What are some of those influence techniques, right? Because we've used those active listening skills. Well, number 1, validate, validate, validate. We need to validate their emotions. You have every right to be angry, you know, and find some truth in what they're saying, agree with it. And if something was unjust, apologize. Be like, man, you seem really angry. I completely understand you being angry, man. If I didn't get my lunch, I'd be pissed off too. I'm sorry that happened to you, right? Now they feel like they've been heard. That's a huge one. Then you can refer to the policies of whatever, of the prison or the institution that you're in. You know, it sucks that you're going through this. I can see it's really difficult, but the policies at the prison say that we're not allowed to engage in this kind of banter in the hallway. Because what have I done now? It's not about me telling you that you can't do this. It's about the policies in the institution. So now I don't have to back down. He doesn't have to back down, because it's about something bigger than the both of us, right? It's about the policies of the institution. They're the reason that they need to fall in line. And then we give them options, right? Just be concise, respectful, give them options instead of threats. People like to be asked instead of told. And we need to focus on what we want them to do, not what we don't want them to do. So what I might say is, man, it really sucks that you didn't get your lunch because of what happened over there. And I'd be angry too. You know, unfortunately, the policies here state that we can't linger in the hallway after the cafeteria has closed. If you continue to go down this road, you're going to receive an infraction. I know you don't want that. If you follow me here to your room, we can at least start moving down the path toward getting you what you need. So I've given them an option. Now I've referred to the policies and I've validated their emotions, right? Then we want to start to persuade. Some things that you might want to think about when you talk about persuasion. Again, these are entire classes. Reciprocity. People, if you give them something, they feel like they owe you. So sometimes if you give a little bit, like, if, you know, hey, okay, come on over here, when they feel like, okay, now I owe him. So those are some things that you can use. People like to be consistent. So if you can get them to commit to say they'll do something, then they want to follow through, or to be consistent with the way they normally behave. So those are some things that you can use when you're interacting with them. Try to point out how they may be being inconsistent, so that they can they'll follow with what you want to do. We use social proof, and that is look what everyone else is doing. Because if they don't know what to do and they see others doing it, that may be something that persuades them. They're more willing to do things for people if they like them. So oftentimes, again, when you're spending this time, you're understanding where they're coming from, you're identifying their needs. Maybe you're discussing some things that you have in common, like tattoos or sports teams, or the fact that you're both, you know, part of the same institution and subject to the same rules here. That may help persuade them a little bit, because they feel that they're like you. Authority, that just by the nature of who you are in there, that has a little bit in the persuasion. I don't rely too much on that, other than if you're a subject matter expert in a particular thing or area or policy, or, you know, a particular faction of the prison, that you know things that might get you some persuasive ability. And then scarcity. So when something's going to be taken away, or there's a limited time, that tends to persuade people. So sometimes when you're giving options, if you want to make the, hey, you know, I can only do this for a little bit longer, that may push them into the, you know, into taking that option. So just, again, these are just briefly, you know, the highlight. We could go much more detail, but we're limited on time here. And yet, even though you do engage in all this active listening and persuasion, there are going to be those who challenge you. And, what do you do? And that's when you just, if you have to issue commands, sometimes you just need to use short directives, elevated tone, and say, John, sit down now. And just be calm, confident, direct, without being antagonistic, offensive, insulting, right? Other times, you may just want to phrase it like something to the effect of the way you want, what you want them to do instead of the punishment that's going to happen. So you may want to say something to the effect of, instead of saying, either you put that knife down or I'm going to come take it out of your hand and you're going to be in solitary confinement. You may say something along the lines of, John, I could see you're really angry. I totally understand it. If you put the knife down right now and you walk with me, we can avoid having an infraction and we could see about getting you that meal that you didn't get. I've now focused them on the positive as opposed to confronting them directly and challenging them, right? So that is one of the ways that we can deal with challenges. And there's plenty of them, but that just kind of gives you an idea. And the last thing that we're going to talk about here, because I know we're coming up on time, is we want to reinforce and empower these individuals, right? So what we want to do through all of this is we have allowed them this whole concept of de-escalation. I started with self-regulation, right? De-escalation is really just allowing somebody to self-regulate, right? Showing them the way, guiding them, providing the environment that helps them to self-regulate. And so what we want to do is after they've started to come down from that crisis, their behavior is starting to decrease a little bit. We've still got that cortisol, we've still got that adrenaline in the system, and you've probably seen it where it can light back up again really quickly. So when we start to get them over the hump, we don't just quit. What we want to do is we want to continue to provide whatever we can that's going to support them continuing to self-regulate, to de-escalate. So that may mean continuing to remove them from whatever the stimulus is, right? If it's an individual that's got them going off, you've probably seen where even after you got them separated and they're both calmed down, one makes a comment to the other and then it lights right back up again. So if you get them separated where they're out of earshot or out of eyesight, that can't happen. So you're providing that support so that it doesn't light back up again, right? Continue to say, hey, thank you, I appreciate you coming over here. And just showing them that self-regulation techniques that they just engaged in is worthwhile and it's going to get them what they want. And that's what we have on the bottom there about reinforcing and supporting, right? We want to validate they did the right thing. And as a result of that, they've got their needs met, right? Not because of the behavior that they were exhibiting, but because of the fact that they self-regulated, that they de-escalated, that they collaborated. And now when we start doing that, what are we doing? We're really kind of teaching them how to self-regulate. And so hopefully they start choosing that path going forward as opposed to engaging in that behavior in the future and being confrontational. So there's your kind of answers on the summary here. Why would we want to implement this? Because when you do, you're going to have officers in the jail setting who are going to communicate, connect. They're going to empathize with these individuals, start finding their needs that are not met, rather than just coming in, using force and instilling their will, right? We're focusing on what needs are not being met and trying to fill those to de-escalate. But the nice part is when the inmates are getting those needs met, they're more compliant because there's no need for that behavior anymore, right? Which creates a safer environment for everybody. So now we're diffusing potentially violent situations. Inmates are being more voluntarily compliant. Your officers and your inmates are not getting injured. And let's face it, not only do the inmates potentially fall victim to trauma as a result of these physical encounters, the corrections officers may as well, right? So there's a decrease of trauma as a result because you don't have as many violent situations. And I don't know where all you are, but I know in the United States, liability is huge within law enforcement and corrections. But if that is the case where you are, the fact that we are not engaging in these violent encounters and people getting injured, your liability is decreased. And let's face it, at the end of the day, we're doing the right thing because we're treating people like humans, right? We're giving them the respect and the dignity that they deserve. So I've put my information up here for anybody that wants to get in touch with me. Feel more than free to do so. And I know John, of course, has my info as well. If you don't have it or you can't copy it in time, easiest way is just go to insightfulcrisisresponse.com and send me an email there, and I'd love to chat with you. But other than that, that was the presentation. So I will open it up to questions. I think I'm pretty much right on time.
I think there's a question and answer icon at the bottom of the page for me. I don't know if oh, okay, Dan has made a comment. Wonderful, inspirational presentation. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
You know, I want to, before the others steal my thunder, I think that's one of the best presentations that we've ever had. It was clear, it was linear and understandable. The slides were entertaining. I can see why Troy won Trainer of the Year, that's for sure. I think it was just terrific. So we have a couple people that have raised their hands. Let's see if we can see if I can find out who they are. Can you go, can the hand, Dan, did you, go ahead, did you want to ask a question, Dan? I have
They may not, yeah, I know there's been some problems with the audio and the chat. I think the Q&A was working.
I think Dan has got internet problems because he's authorized to speak. Dan, can you put it in the Q&A? Or in the chat, we can. I found out a button to open it up for everybody in the chat. So you can use the question and answer or use the chat.
Yeah, I know Sam had written he needs more info in the PowerPoint if possible. He works in correctional facilities. So yeah, I mean, Sam, certainly if you want to get in touch with me, just go to Troy, Troy, at insightfulcrisisresponse.com and just email me there and we can go ahead and answer anything else long-term, you know, set up a Zoom or a phone call or whatever you need.
Can you see the chat, Troy?
Yeah, I just got another one. It's like Ben. I don't know if it's Benja, but it cut out. It might be Benjamin. I can't tell. Looking to have the presentation on email. So yeah, I mean, anybody that is interested, if you do want a copy of it, just let me know. Again, just email me at Troy, Troy, at insightfulcrisisresponse.com. And I'll be more than happy to give you whatever you need. So Dan was asking, can you explain the difference between react and respond? Yeah, so when we react to something, I think of it much along the lines of, say, for example, somebody was to throw a punch at you, right? What do? You throw your hand up right away. We just react. There is no thought. Something else is controlling your response. When I respond to something, I am going in with a more thoughtful approach. I'm assessing the scene. I am in control of myself and my reaction so that I can have a better response. So that's kind of the difference between react and respond. Did that clarify it for you, Dan? He said, wonderful. So it looks like that did.
So we're getting, can you see the Q&As?
Yeah, I got one here. When too many inmates are in aggressive mood, how should an officer deal with, address the whole group or individuals? Okay, so Upneat, I will tell you this up front. I am not a corrections officer. I was in law enforcement out on the road. However, I do know my friends in corrections and having conversations with them. One of the a couple of things. Number one, of course, status above all, never humiliate anybody in front of each other. When we start talking about larger groups, that is beyond my specialty, but what I have heard from corrections officers with whom I interact that are involved in the crisis intervention, if we want to identify the instigators and try to, separate them, that's part of that audience management thing, so that we can then remove the instigator from the crowd. And oftentimes what they find is that when that instigator is in private, they're a completely different person. They calm down. It's all an act. It's a show. It's the support status, so again, I don't have a variety of group intervention tactics. That's why I specifically geared this toward individual crisis today, because that's my forte. But just to give you a little bit, like I said, from what I've heard, is to identify the instigators in the crowd, get them separated from the masses so that they're no longer instigating, and then deal with it that way. So I hope that helps a little bit.
All right, we got time for one more question, and then we're over our time limit, so I need to wind it up. But if there's anybody that has a question, please put it in the question and answer. Let's see what Upneat says. Thanks, Troy. All right, I want to thank everyone, of course, for attending tonight. It was good to see many of the names that I recognize and many names I did not. And I will look forward to continuing our conversation and building the global justice, or the global justice neighborhood. But we will end for tonight. Stay out of trouble. Be kind to people who love you.
And thank you so much for having me tonight, John. I appreciate it. It was great to meet you all.
It was fantastic, Troy. It was really wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.